It's one thing to listen to doom and gloom about food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation. It's quite another thing to hear practical, immediately actionable advice from experts who can help you reduce the fear, anxiety, and burden of these problems. Tune in now to the Surviving Hard Times podcast from the Finding Genius Foundation with Richard Jacobs. Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy in my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out, and I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on Current Initiatives. And now, to our guest. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Surviving Hard Times podcast, sponsored by the Finding Genius Foundation.
I have Brandon Collins. He's an associate adjunct professor, part of the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management. He's a lead scientist at Berkeley Forests, and all this is under the purview of UC Berkeley in California. So we're going to talk about fire dynamics and forest management. So, Brandon, thank you for coming.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me, Rich.
Yeah, if you would, tell me a bit about your background, or how did you get interested in fire management?
Yeah, that's interesting. I can't trace it to like an aha moment when I sort of figured, or I knew that's what I wanted to do. But when I do think about it, there were a couple things that kind of imprinted me, and I'll bet you they sort of guided me to where I am. But I remember, I think I was, maybe 12 years old or something when we had a wildfire, and I live in a pretty urban area. I lived in Alameda, California at that point in time, the East Bay, and there was a fire in the Oakland Hills, and it was pretty eye-opening to me to imagine that, something could get sort of out of control in a relatively urban area like that. And it was, just shocked me, frankly, that we could see some of the effects of that fire even in Alameda. Like, I remember being at a football field and ash was falling on the football field. And it was actually like, when I held it in my hand, it was like a book page, I think. You could see the print on it. It was super strange. So yeah, that was obviously had some effect. And then I think another thing, obviously, is my dad had a degree in forestry. He never actually really went into the field of forestry, but, through experiences, backpacking or camping with my dad, and then even in talking about that fire in the Oakland Hills, it got super interesting to me. And so I think that, that must have had an influence on me. But again, like I said, it didn't just click right away when I was 12 and said, oh, I want to be a forester. So that's some of the background.
So what are some of the typical duties, or what's a day like in, someone's whose job it is to understand and prevent fires? I don't know if you're more in the academic end, or if you're also out in the field a lot, but what does it look like? What's your day look like?
I do tend to be more on the academic end, although I really try to engage as much as possible with people that are sort of on the more frontline management. And that would be more on the forest management side rather than the actual incident management on a fire per se. But a typical day for me is, sadly, a lot of it is sitting behind a computer, but it does vary quite a bit. We interacting with graduate students, teaching classes, interacting with colleagues, having meetings, many of which now are, of course, are on Zoom. But those meetings oftentimes are with colleagues, like my forest management colleagues. Some, up in the Sierras, for example. I tend to work in the Northern Sierra on the Plumas National Forest quite a bit, but I also work in Yosemite and also in the Sierra National Forest. So it does vary quite a bit, and it does matter too what season we're in, right? If it's the summer season, I tend to do a lot more field work in the summer, and we have field crews largely made up of undergraduate students that are employed by us for the summer to do field measurements. So we do get out quite a bit. It's a really, as far as as far as I see it, it's such an ideal job. It combines, some really, down to earth sort of connection to managing natural resources, right? Managing forests, and then also some kind of more intellectual pieces, with regard to conducting science, interpreting, results from analyses, and trying to connect those analyses to, how managers might actually use that, as opposed to just having, some article sitting in a journal somewhere.
But what are you trying to figure out about fire management? Are you trying to quantify like how they start or how to control them? Like, what are some of the nuances of what you do?
I think the biggest piece is really how to manage forests so that they can withstand fire. And it's kind of weird. We struggle with this weird balance, if you will, that it's not, a lot of our job and a lot, frankly, the goal of forest management and fire-prone forests is not really to eliminate fire. Now, that might not really sit well with a lot of people because their homes might be near forests and they don't want fire at all. But the reality is, I think it's impossible to remove fire entirely from these fire-prone forests. Before we started messing with forests, they were burning really frequently, and in many cases, the burning was augmented by ignitions from indigenous peoples. But nonetheless, fire was such a common process going on in these forests. It shaped them. In fact, we're starting to understand that forests entirely depend on fire, but it's the type of fire that matters. And so a lot of our research is geared towards trying to manage forests so that it's able to tolerate the right type of fire and then have the right kind of responses, after fire. And we're a long ways off from that, frankly. And it's not, I don't mean from a science standpoint, but we're a long ways off having the forest in that condition.
Well, so what are the benefits of fire, and to what level should it be controlled? Like, what are some of the factors that would tell you, this place actually does need a fire to clear it out?
So the benefits of fire are that we have generally fairly productive forests, meaning that they are constantly growing. They're constantly, adding new foliage on existing trees or new trees. Young trees are establishing, and fire is a little bit of a check on the system, right? To keep it from getting accumulation of plant material, oftentimes what we call fuel on the ground. That accumulation is held in check by relatively frequent fire. And fire also actually limits the density of forests so that there is less competition among individual trees. You might say, well, why would you want that? And the reason for that is that under drought periods, which are, is a fairly common occurrence in the West, and under drought, trees are stressed and likely they will be invaded by some pathogen or some insect. And if you are able to thin out the trees, or if fire were operating in a manner that kept tree density in check, individual trees would have more vigor and would be able to withstand some of those attacks from pathogens and insects. In the current case, in many of our forests that don't have fire and are certainly, way too dense, that tree vigor is not there. And we've seen some massive mortality events in our forests in recent years that have really put a spotlight on this issue.
So a fire will allow certain trees to have, again, more growing space, more access to resources, counterintuitively. So if fire doesn't come, I guess you'll end up with a swath of forest where everything is kind of barely hanging on, so that if something does happen, the whole thing gets wiped out.
It is, right. And so in the past, we would always just, the looming threat was when a fire does come, it's going to, it's really going to be destructive. And this, like you said, it's going to kill all the trees. but we didn't really have experience with just drought alone being, enough of an agent to then precipitate large scale mortality until the massive drought we had in the Sierra Nevada in 2012 through 2016, where it wasn't really fire that was doing it. It was drought and then bark beetles that were killing large patches of trees over a massive amount of area. And so now we have this, that threat is not just about, when wildfire comes, it's about, when the next drought comes. And people know how frequent drought can be. So I think that it's both those pieces right now. And I think that we have some ability to manage our forests looking at the past as sort of a reference, if you will, for what kind of densities would be sort of sustainable and resilient is the word we often use a lot, under that drought and future wildfire scenario.
So what are some of the practices that can help forests, like clearing underbrush or
there's really two, right? And there's different levels of it. There's different intensities, there's combinations or whatever, but there's really two methods, right? You can either cut trees, you can do it, cut them mechanically with a chainsaw or with equipment, or you can burn them. And it often cases, the one or the other seems to make more sense, right? Like if you're around homes, you're not probably thrilled about the idea of using fire, at least right away, until you can get the forest in a better condition. So it makes more sense to do some kind of mechanical removal of, stuff along, smallish trees that are in that understory. And even frankly, oftentimes we oversimplify by saying, clear out the underbrush, so to speak. But it really is, we're at a point now where we need to be doing pretty extensive thinning. And that thinning is different. A lot of people will conflate that with logging and saying, you just want to pull trees out to send them down to the mill. And I think that the difference there is what you leave behind. If you leave the largest trees behind, then you're doing what might be considered an ecologically appropriate thinning. If you're taking the largest trees, then you're just really doing a timber grab and you're not doing anything for restoration, and it's really not consistent with the ecology. So we struggle, there is a pushback about anything mechanical because of that removal, but it hopefully we're getting over some of those speed bumps.
Well, what's best if, what does it depend on? What are the factors? So if there's an area where there's trees, big and small, young and old, which ones are the better ones to take and why? Should you leave the old ones, the big fat ones, or just, or should you take the big ones and the small ones?
Well, in our current condition, given some of the history we have of true logging, right? Not ecologically based, but just true timber-based logging, we really do have a deficit of large trees. If you even compare it to historical conditions where we have a lot more trees on the landscape now, but many fewer large trees. And it turns out that those large trees have often been described as the ecological backbone of these forests. And it's not just about, how they look. They are kind of cool, right? It's neat to see a big tree and they really have this charismatic feeling to them. But it's really about the other attributes that those big trees provide from an ecosystem standpoint, right? The habitat conditions that a large tree provides, the resistance that a large tree has to fire. Those large trees have really thick bark. Their crowns are well off the ground, so they're not really vulnerable to fires burning along the surface. But so that's the thing. So to go back to your question, the issue is, yes, leave the largest trees, leave the oldest trees. Some of the oldest trees, older and larger, they tend to be the same. But some of the older trees are actually kind of interesting because they have odd growth forms. And some of those growth forms make these really neat cavities for wildlife species. The California spotted owl is one we tend to focus on a lot. Pacific fisher is another one. And they like these little cavities that really develop in these kind of gnarled old trees. So yes, I think the ideal prescription would be to leave the largest and the oldest trees, vary it a bit too, by the way. We don't want, we're learning more and more that variability is a pretty important characteristic of these forests to serve these different guilds of wildlife species in the habitats they require. So, we can get into more of that if you'd like. I don't know if that answers your question enough.
Well, so when you say variability, what do you mean? So thicker trees and thinner, younger and older, what else comprises variability?
Yes. So the answer, yes, is yes, some thick areas, right? It's okay to have some areas of dense trees, even if they're young and small, because those provide these dense cover patches for some prey. They also provide thermal regulation for some animals that don't do well in the extremes, either the extreme cold or the extreme heat. So that condition, I mean, it's often, again, simplified. Like either we thin it all or it's all going to burn up. But that's not necessarily true. It's really about the scale, sort of the fuels problem, right? If you have these small patches where you have high densities, they're just not that vulnerable because they might be surrounded by a lot of areas with low fuel conditions where it's really difficult to vector, severe fire into these denser patches. So it's a variability, meaning yes, a mix of ages of trees, but also spatially variable, where you might actually intentionally retain patches, maybe let's say on the order of a quarter acre or something like that of dense forest, and you might actually open up an area, have an opening about the size of a quarter acre to allow for new establishment of trees or even shrubs. And that's okay. A lot of times we think, oh, shrubs are bad. They just, they make fire more intense, but I think that variable piece at small spatial scales where we're not having giant patches of any one particular condition, I think that's something we're trying to strive towards.
What about natural features? Gullies, gulches, ravines, ponds, lakes, etc. How do all these things impact fire?
Well, they do. They certainly can inhibit, or in some cases can enhance spread. If you think about it, if you have some local, let's say, depressions where water tends to pool, and I don't mean surface water, but just where there's maybe higher soil moisture, those kinds of areas can support more vegetation, even if fire was burning, burning fairly freely on the landscape. They just might be cooler and a little, with slightly higher fuel moistures, where they may have been missed by fire. Even if fire was frequent on the landscape, there's some areas that are missed. And that even happens in today's fires. But so you can imagine that these little features on the landscape, and some of which you mentioned too, rock or steep gullies, some of those could be true barriers to fire spread. But some of the other features, could enhance fire spread where they naturally support higher densities of vegetation. And really, the complexity really can grow quickly. And, in terms of the number of options or the amount of things you want to consider in terms of those landscape features. But the point being that those kinds of features, whether they enhance or inhibit spread, really do reinforce that notion of variability across a landscape.
What if you were to get together communities of a certain size and make like fire prevention based HOAs or guidelines? And like an individual house, I can see it'd be hard to make fire breaks for that house. But has anyone proposed that? Like, you own your house, that's fine, but you're in an area with 45 other homes that comprise this area that's prone to fire. Could anything be, again, imposed that would actually be helpful? Can a group of homeowners, let's say, pool together resources to create a fire break that next time there's a fire, all their stuff doesn't burn?
Yes, there are instances where those kinds of arrangements are taking place. Frankly, the community wildfire protection plans that are going in so many areas are really trying to get at that, a pooling of resources, or in some cases a clearinghouse for grants, which is often the case, either federal or state. But the other piece that those kinds, if you're getting even more specific, like an HOA, like you spoke about, one of the things that they can do in addition to managing vegetation around the house is try to impose, new building standards, either through retrofitting or for new construction, where you're building with less flammable materials and also building it, in a way that, keeps, fire sort of on the forefront of your mind in terms of what it can do to a home. A lot of people think that, fires, these wildfires just, build up a head of steam and then just kind of run right over housing developments. And that actually can happen. But the more common instances where homes are lost is where you have these massive ember showers that are created from the wildlands just adjacent to these homes. And so we can do better building that is, can be more resistant to those types of ember showers. So it can happen on both sides where you're managing vegetation better, and then you're also doing better building practices.
Okay. All right. Excellent. So what are some of the big issues that you're focused in on that people may not be aware of in terms of understanding fire, controlling fire, et cetera?
So one of the things that we have been working on for years is this idea of actually allowing wildfires to burn, when you could otherwise put them out. And it's been controversial, especially more lately. It's actually even entered the political sphere with some of our politicians sort of weighing in on it. We had a fire a couple years back called the Tamarack Fire that was burning in the Sierra just south of Tahoe, and it wasn't totally let go. I don't think that anyone would ever claim that fire was just allowed to burn and they were just, doing nothing, but it just didn't probably rank up priority wise in terms of what else was going on. So the inference that was made that, they were just letting that fire burn. Well, it turns out that, weather changed and the fire made a big run and burned into town and burned a few homes down, and it created all this controversy that is a failed program. Essentially, the idea of allowing naturally ignited wildfires to burn is failed. But the case, I don't know, the issues are complex, but there have been many areas where that has been the practice for decades, but those areas are isolated. They tend to be kind of higher elevation, surrounded by a lot of rock, where the fires can't really break out of these big basins too easily and start to impact structures. So it's just kind of one of those things where there's a time and a place for that. And frankly, to be honest, I think we'd like to have those places where you could allow wildfires to burn expand. I don't think we're not there yet because of the condition of the forest, but I think it's going to be a tool that we're going to need, frankly, because there's just no way we can burn enough. We have so many barriers to doing prescribed burning where we intentionally do it, and we do it at such small scales. We burn tens of acres at a time. If in best cases, maybe a couple hundred. But if we can get, wildfire and it's under relatively favorable conditions and it won't impact homes, that can burn thousands of acres in a more positive manner. That's going to be something that is kind of, that's where, again, like I said, where we'd like to head is allowing fires to burn while all the while, of course, protecting, sort of life and property.
Well, what are some of the misunderstandings you see from the public or from politicians or governments about what's needed?
I think one of the old thoughts why to go way back into wildfire sort of suppression, one of the big drivers was the impact to timber. We saw the forest as sort of, our supply of timber for, a growing economy. And it still is. I mean, there's nothing wrong with managing the forest for timber. I don't have any problems with that. But it was the main driver, right? Timber was the main driver and fire was the main enemy. So it was, it was decided long ago, we're going to eliminate fire in order to protect this really important resource. So the timber focus is not nearly what it was in contemporary forests, at least in a lot of national forests. There's still plenty of private timberland where producing timber is the main thing. But on our national forests, the timber production has gone down so much that it's really, we really are trying to do that multiple use mandate for managing for wildlife and recreation and lots of other things. So the misconception is now that if you are allowing fire to burn, then you're destroying some of those resources, again, timber being one of the main ones. But I just don't think that's not terribly relevant anymore because we don't harvest that much. And it's not a direct impact, so to speak. So that's one of the misconceptions. The other misconception, I think, is that we can eliminate fire from these forests if we just did enough thinning. And I just think there's no way we can get to enough ground, treating it mechanically to really make a difference on its own. We are going to need fire, both prescribed and naturally ignited wildfires, to deal with this fuels problem, which is constant, right? It's like I was talking about before, with the forest constantly growing, constantly producing, dead needles and branches and stuff that break off in the wind and deposit on the floor. We can't do anything with a lot of that material with machines. So fire can do it for us and do it relatively cheaply. So there really isn't a solution where we can eliminate fire altogether.
Yeah, makes sense. So what's the best way for people to learn more about your work, and to go deeper if they wish to? Where can they go?
Yeah, that's a good point, because a lot of our work is in scientific papers, and they're not terribly fun reads. They're not terribly accessible, frankly, to a lot of people. But one of the things that we've been doing with a lot of our recent papers is creating these briefs, these like 2-pagers, and they really do try to distill, like a 10 or 12 or 15 page scientific paper down into pretty basic language, with a couple graphs and stuff. So that is one thing that we can get, we do have on our website, on that Berkeley Forest website. And we're also doing videos, I think, too, with Berkeley Forests. One of our extension specialists, Rob York, has done a really nice job with some of these videos. In fact, we had a wildfire that burned this summer onto our research forest. It burned a few hundred acres onto our research forest, overall about a 70,000 acre fire. And it actually had some really interesting effects on our research forest, given some of our previous management. But Rob did a nice job of taking some videos right after the fire, and he's explaining some of the history of what we've done on these forests. So I think these videos are something that we're going to probably start doing a little more of, and that's another tool I think that just your average person interested maybe in fire and forest management can pick up and maybe get some information relatively easily.
Okay. Well, very good. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast. And like I said, it's an unusual topic, but I appreciate what you talked about. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Before you stop listening, ask yourself, what are 1 or 2 useful things you heard on this podcast that can help you overcome food and fertilizer shortages, skyrocketing prices, the cost of living, or your job being outsourced overseas or eliminated due to automation? Please like and subscribe and tell your friends and family about the Surviving Hard Times podcast. We're all going to need help now and in the near future.